He figured it was a raccoon pilfering his gear amidst the raging storm. But as retired Marine Lucas Harrison forced open his shed door, a flashlight beam slicing the darkness, it wasn't a varmint he found. It was a starving German Shepherd pup, its small leg mangled in an industrial-strength rat trap. The little pup was terrified, growling and snapping at the very man trying to free him. Lucas lived by the mountain's code, never get attached. Yet staring at that defenseless, yet defiant creature, he made a decision that would alter his life forever. He risked his own hands to wrench the steel trap open, but there was no gratitude, only a desperate scramble back into the freezing downpour. Could it possibly survive the night? And could it ever bring itself to trust a human again? Before we share the legend of this broken little dog, let me know where you're watching from. Just drop your country in the comments. And if you believe in defending the defenseless, please subscribe. The wind didn't just blow through the Absaroka range of Montana, it shrieked. It was a living, breathing, furious entity tearing down from the jagged peaks, ripping the last autumn leaves from the aspens and smothering the world in a premature blanket of suffocating white. The lights of Whitefish were miles away, a distant galaxy of warm lights and family meals, a different planet from the stark isolation of the high country. Out here, on the edge of the wild, a storm wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a siege. Inside his cabin of rough-hewn cedar and solid stone, the air was still warm and unnervingly silent. Lucas Harrison sat alone at his small kitchen table, a mug of black coffee growing cold in his grip. He was a man who looked as if he were carved from the very same rock that formed the mountains outside. At 45, his hair was still high and tight, the temples surrendering to gray, and his face held their lines of a map, etched in some far-off combat zone. He was a retired gunnery sergeant, United States Marine Corps, a gunny to the bone, even though his uniform now hung in a plastic sheath. Deep in a closet he refused to open. He stared at the wall clock as the second hand swept past the 12. It was precisely 1800 hours. Time for dinner. He rose to his feet, his movements deliberate and efficient. There was no wasted motion in Lucas Harrison. He pulled open a can of beef stew and emptied its contents into a pot, setting the burner to medium. He didn't turn on a radio. He didn't hum a tune. He simply existed inside the regimen he'd constructed for himself, a fortress of routine meant to keep the chaos of his memories locked away. Every corner of his small cabin was immaculate. The throw blanket on the armchair was folded with corners sharp enough to cut glass. His boots by the door stood in perfect parallel alignment. It wasn't a life, it was a museum, not a home. A home needed mess and noise and another heartbeat besides his own. Lucas slowly stirred the stew, his gaze drifting to the empty space on the rug by the hearth. For 3 years, that exact spot belonged to Gunnar, a Belgian Malinois who was always more than just a dog. Gunnar had been his eyes, his ears, the only soul who ever understood the language of his nightmares. When Gunnar passed, it wasn't in the heat of battle, but from a cancer that grew silent and unseen in the night. The silence in the cabin had become a deafening roar. Lucas decided right then he was done with love. Love was a liability. Love was a weakness that shattered you when it left. A sudden sharp crack echoed from outside, slicing through the howl of the wind. Lucas froze, spoon hovering mid-air, his head cocked, listening with the ingrained intensity of a man perpetually on guard. That wasn't a branch on the roof. It was the sharp crack of wood on wood coming from the old shed 50 yards out from the house. Any other man might dismiss it as wind. To Lucas, every unexpected sound was a threat. The burner clicked off. He didn't run. His movements were a silent, terrifying grace. He snatched his heavy canvas coat from its hook, jammed his feet into boots, and grabbed the heavy-duty flashlight. His eyes flickered past the shotgun over the mantel, but he didn't reach. He had no need for it. He was the weapon. He moved out onto the porch, where the cold struck him like a fist. The snow drove sideways, stinging his exposed face like tiny shards of shrapnel as he ducked his head. Shoulders braced against the gale, he marched to the shed. The snow screamed under his boots with every step, the only steady beat in the swirling chaos of the night. The shed door hung open, slamming wildly in the wind. Crashing against its frame again and again, Lucas moved in from the side, avoiding the fatal funnel of the doorway. He threw the door wide with a kick, the flashlight's beam slicing through the darkness inside. "Clear out," he commanded, his voice rough from long silence, yet it held the undeniable weight of command. He expected a raccoon, maybe a starving coyote, or nothing more than a broken latch. The light carved through the darkness, illuminating stacks of firewood, old tools, forgotten bags of feed. And then it froze. In the deepest corner, pinned between some old tires and a rusted-out engine, a pair of eyes caught the light. They stared back, a luminous greenish gold, wide and utterly unwavering. This was no raccoon. Lucas edged forward the floorboards, groaning in protest. The small creature tried to retreat, but a harsh metallic clang brought it up short. "Hold," Lucas ordered, his voice dropping low and steady. He advanced slowly, bathing the intruder in light. It was a dog, a German Shepherd pup, maybe 5 or 6 months old. A skeleton draped in matted fur, its ribs stark against a coat caked with mud and ice. It was a phantom, something the storm had coughed up just to let it perish. But the dog's condition wasn't what made Lucas stop cold. It was the absolute, profound silence. The pup's front paw was clamped in a heavy-duty rat trap, one Lucas had set ages ago, and completely forgotten about. The steel bar had crushed down on its small toes. The pain had to be excruciating. Any other dog would be screaming, whining, thrashing in a desperate panic. But this dog was quiet. It pressed back into the tires, its small body racked with violent tremors, yet it made no sound at all. Its ears were plastered flat against its skull. Its lips peeled back just enough to reveal sharp white teeth, and a deep resonant growl rumbled in its chest. It was the sound of a being that had come to expect nothing but pain, that anticipated the end, and had resolved to meet it with defiance. Lucas slowly lowered the beam of the flashlight, breaking eye contact to de-escalate. A strange, sharp ache tightened in his chest. "You're a fighter, aren't you?" Lucas breathed. He knew that look. He'd seen it reflected in the eyes of young Marines in the sand, kids who were scared to death but would not break. This was no pet. This was a soldier. The pup watched his every move, tracking his slightest motion. It was standing guard over a ripped-open bag of beef jerky Lucas kept for emergencies. The thief was caught, not red-handed, but red-pawed. Lucas dropped to a knee. A snap of teeth met the air, a clear warning. Easy now." Lucas's voice was firm. "I'm not here to hurt you, but you're caught in the wire, Marine." He crept closer. The dog's growl rumbled deeper. A low, constant thunder of defiance. Lucas saw the dark blood pooling where the steel jaws bit into flesh. If he didn't move fast, the bitter cold would claim the leg, or the poison of infection would claim its life. "All right, I'm coming in," Lucas declared. His movement was a blur of practiced economy. His left hand shot forward, seizing the thick scruff of the dog's neck, pinning the animal to the floorboards before it could lunge. It thrashed, shockingly powerful for its frame claws, scrabbling wildly on the rough wood. A single sharp gasp was torn from its throat, yet it made no cry of pain. "Hold still," Lucas commanded, his voice a calm, unbreakable anchor in the chaos. With his free hand, Lucas felt for the trap's spring. It was frozen shut with rust. He set his jaw, his fingers straining against the frigid metal. The dog instantly went rigid under his grip, bracing for the blow it knew was coming, but the blow never landed. Lucas squeezed. With a sickening crack of metal, the trap's jaw sprang open. "Go on," Lucas urged, releasing his hold. He snatched his hands back, expecting teeth to sink into his flesh. The dog scrambled away, tumbling into a stack of old tires. It held its wounded paw clear of the frozen ground, refusing to put weight on it. But it didn't bolt. It stood on 3 legs, chest heaving, its breath pluming in the icy air. Its eyes flicked from the open doorway back to Lucas. He remained on one knee, silhouetted by the beam of his flashlight. which threw long, distorted shadows across the shed. He stared at the dog, this ragged, starving thief that had breached his solitude. "You're free now," Lucas said, the words feeling alien as he spoke to the stray. "So get out of here." He half expected a gesture of thanks, a tail wag, a soft whine, maybe even a cautious lick to his outstretched hand. That's how it happened in stories. But this was no storybook creature. This dog was born of the wild, where it had learned that hands only ever meant to hurt. The German Shepherd met Lucas's gaze one final time. There was no gratitude in that look. It was a cold assessment, a soldier's appraisal of a threat. Then, with a deep growl that felt like a curse on the wind, the dog turned and fled. It wasn't a clean run. It was a broken, three-legged limp that took it from the light and into the blinding blizzard. Lucas rose slowly, the ache in his knees a familiar complaint. He moved to the doorway and stared into the swirling blackness. Its tracks were already vanishing under a fresh blanket of snow. "Stubborn son of a bitch," Lucas breathed, and a small, dry smile cracked the weathered mask of his face for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. He shut the heavy shed door, throwing the bolt home against the howling gale. He walked toward the cabin, the cold clawing at his coat, but a fire was lit in his blood. Inside, the stew simmered on the stove, its rich scent of beef and thyme a welcoming shield against the storm. He ladled a bowl and returned to the table. The clock marked the time. The wind raged. The familiar emptiness was restored. But as he brought the spoon to his lips, his gaze drifted to the window. All he saw was his own haunted reflection in the dark pane. A solitary man in a forgotten house. But behind his eyes he still saw the dog's wild green gold and utterly unbroken. The silence of the cabin remained, but it was a different kind of quiet now. It was no longer an absence, but a presence. A silent watch had begun. And for the first time in an age, Lucas Harrison wasn't just surviving until morning. He was left wondering if the ghost from the storm would ever return. The tempest was over, leaving the mountains scoured and achingly bright. A heavy mantle of snow burdened the branches of the ponderosa pines, hushing the world beneath its pristine blanket. For 3 days, the valley remained a portrait of suspended, frozen time, broken only by the single thin column of smoke breathing from Lucas Harrison's chimney. Lucas moved through his morning rituals with the same vacant, mechanical precision. But now his gaze was no longer fixed on the task before him. As he split the firewood, his eyes would drift to the tree line. While clearing the porch, his stare swept the deep shadows pooling beneath the shed. The phantom was still out there. Lucas felt it in his bones, even without a single sighting since the storm. The signs were everywhere. The fresh snow along his property line was broken, but not by the haphazard wanderings of deer or elk, but by the deliberate pacing prints of a sentinel on patrol. The lid of his trash can was shifted but not overturned. The animal was close, watching, waiting. Then, on the 4th morning, Lucas opened his door to a discovery on the welcome mat. It wasn't the grisly offering of a stray cat, no dead bird or field mouse. It was a single glove, an old leather work glove he'd tossed on the burn pile weeks back, the one with the thumb completely split open. Stiff with frost and gnawed at the cuff, it was nonetheless placed with deliberate care dead center on his mat. Lucas lifted the glove, turning it in his hands. His gaze rose to scan the yard, and there he was. At the edge of the woods, partly concealed by a snowdrift, sat the German Shepherd. The dog was still painfully thin, his ribs etching shadows against his tan and black coat. He held himself with a noble bearing, favoring an injured front paw, lifting it just clear of the frozen ground. His ears were pricked forward, his intelligent eyes locked on Lucas. There was no wagging tail. No whine escaped him. He just stared, waiting for the transaction to be honored. Lucas let out a short, dry puff of air. "You have got to be kidding me," he muttered. The message couldn't be clearer. This dog wasn't begging. Begging was for the weak. This was a trade. "I returned what is yours, now you give me what is mine." It was a negotiation between two sovereigns, Lucas retreated inside, leaving the door cracked open. He returned moments later, a plastic bowl brimming with high-protein kibble in his hand, the good stuff, the kind he used to buy for Gunnar. He walked to the very edge of the porch and placed the bowl down gently. "Fair trade," Lucas called out, his voice sharp and clear on the frigid air. He stepped back inside, closed the door, and watched through the glass. Only when the deadbolt clicked home did the shepherd move. He didn't rush. He moved with a limping, dignified gait, scanning for threats before finally lowering his head to the bowl. He ate with a quiet efficiency, and then as silently as he had appeared, he melted back into the trees. The next morning, a crushed aluminum can. The day after, a dry, sun-bleached deer bone, one the dog must have carried for miles. Lucas found himself actually anticipating these morning exchanges. It was the only conversation he'd had in years that felt real. But by the week's end, his own supplies were dwindling. Lucas dreaded the supply run, but a man couldn't subsist on coffee and solitude. He hauled himself into his battered Ford pickup, its old engine choking to life in the frigid air as he started the treacherous descent from the mountain toward town. The town was a full-on assault on his senses. The grocery store's harsh lights burned, smelling of fake cinnamon and chemicals. People moved in packs, shoving carts full of junk, their loud voices a drone of weather politics and some TV show. Lucas stalked the aisles like a shark trapped in a fishbowl, lethal coiled and utterly silent. He was a ghost here. He kept his back, covered his eyes, sweeping for the exits. The noise was a physical weight. He despised the empty smiles from strangers, their hollow greetings meaning less than nothing. "You finding everything okay?" a teenage cashier asked, snapping her gum. "Yes," Lucas bit out, severing any chance of meaningless small talk. As he walked out into the parking lot's gray light, he saw a woman struggling to dress a small, fluffy dog. The thing yapped without end. It was overfed, coddled, and utterly useless, nipping petulantly at the woman's hands. She just cooed, calling it her little prince. A hot, sharp anger flared in Lucas. His mind flashed to the warrior dog in the woods, limping, starving, and freezing, yet carrying a dignity this creature could never comprehend. A strange, twisting ache gripped his heart. The realization hit him he felt more connection to that shivering, three-legged ghost on the mountain than to any soul in this entire town. They were both survivors. Both of them shattered, and both just wanted to be left alone. He gunned the engine, driving home much faster. The tires chewed satisfyingly at the gravel as he climbed back into the thin, cold air of his mountain. It was late afternoon when he finally pulled up to his cabin. The setting sun bled across the horizon, casting long, bruised shadows on the snow. Lucas unloaded his supplies, his mind already sinking into the comfort of the immense silence. He decided he would check on the chickens. He had a small coop behind the cabin, mostly for eggs, but also because the simple routine of caring for them gave his empty mornings a purpose. He was halfway to the coop when the chaos erupted. The chickens were squawking a frantic, horrifying sound, a terrified sound that meant one thing and one thing only: predator. Lucas dropped the feed and ran. His hand instinctively went for the knife he always wore on his belt. Rounding the corner of the shed, he finally saw it. A large coyote. It was big and mangy, its yellow eyes glowing with desperate hunger. It had dug under the wire. It had a hen pinned against the coop wall, its teeth bared, ready for the kill. But before the coyote struck, a blur of black and tan fur shot out from the bushes. It was the German shepherd. It slammed into the coyote with all the force of a freight train, knocking the predator sideways deep into the snow. This was a suicide run. The coyote was full-grown and healthy, and it was fighting for its life. The shepherd was a pup, malnourished, fighting on 3 good legs. The coyote snarled, snapping, its jaws finding purchase on the shepherd's shoulder. The pup cried out a sharp yelp of pain, but it did not retreat. Instead, it roared a deep, guttural sound far too large for its small chest. The pup drove forward again, using its broken body to pin the coyote jaws, snapping for the predator's throat. The shepherd wasn't fighting for Lucas. This wasn't some plea for affection. It was a war over resources. These were his chickens. This was his territory. And the coyote, realizing this was no easy prey, clawed its way free, its fangs slashing across the shepherd's nose, drawing a crimson line, and spun to flee. The shepherd lunged, but its wounded leg gave out the strain too much, driving him face first into the cold snow. But the point was made, a brutal lesson delivered. The coyote vaulted the fence and vanished into the woods, its tail tucked in defeat. Lucas stood frozen, his heart pounding his ribs like a drum. The shepherd lay in the snow, its breath coming in ragged pants, blood seeping from a gash on its shoulder and the cut on its snout. It fought to get up, its wounded paw trembling uncontrollably. Its gaze shifted to the chickens, then its head-turned eyes locking with Lucas. There was no cowering, no plea for praise. It just stared at him, chest heaving, the silent message clear, threat neutralized. Lucas moved forward slowly. This time there was no growl. It was simply too spent to fight. It watched him approach, the light in its eyes dimming with exhaustion. Lucas sank to his knees in the snow, ignoring the wet cold that soaked through his jeans. He offered a hand, palm up. The dog flinched, but the teeth never came. "You held the line," Lucas breathed. His voice choked with an emotion he'd buried back in the sandbox. "You held the line, Marine." He didn't try to pet him. Instead, he rose and walked to the cabin's front door. He swung it open wide, propping it with a heavy boot. He stood silhouetted in the doorway, looking back at the wounded dog in the snow. Lucas raised 2 fingers to his lips and blew a sharp, piercing whistle, the command for recall. "Ranger," Lucas called out, "come on inside." It wasn't a request. It was an order. The dog's ears twitched. Ranger. It was not a gentle name. It wasn't a name for a pet. It had the sharp crack of a branch in a silent forest. It sounded like duty. The dog forced itself to its feet. It swayed, found its balance, and then with agonizing slowness began the painful limp toward the warmth of the open door. It paused on the threshold, sniffing the air, the scent of wood smoke and simmering beef stew. It looked up at Lucas, asking for permission one final time. Lucas just stepped aside. Ranger crossed the threshold, his claws ticking against the hardwood floor. He didn't leap on that furniture. He walked directly to the rug before the fire, to the empty space where Gunnar always used to lie, and collapsed with a bone-weary sigh. Lucas shut the door, closing out the biting cold, the wind, and the chaos of the world outside. He stared at the muddy, blood-streaked mass of fur on his rug. The fortress had been breached, and for the first time in 3 years, Lucas didn't mind the intrusion. The weather in the Rockies had a bitter sense of humor. Just as the blizzard's deep freeze began to thaw, turning the entire world into a soupy gray mess, a new storm system rolled down from the north. This was not the clean white powder of postcards. It was sleet, a miserable stinging mix of ice and rain that glazed the asphalt in a lethal sheen of black glass. Lucas Harrison's hands clenched the steering wheel of his Ford pickup. His knuckles bone white, the wipers fought a losing battle, their frantic, hypnotic rhythm slapping uselessly against the freezing slush. He was on his way back from the hardware store in town, a desperate run to fix a burst pipe back at the barn. The truck's heater blasted hot, dry air smelling of dust and motor oil, but the bitter cold outside still seemed to creep right through the steel. He was just 5 miles from his turnoff on a desolate stretch of highway that felt like the very edge of the world. To his left, a sheer drop into blackness. To his right, a dense wall of pines devouring his headlights. And then, he saw it, just a shape on the shoulder. A dark tear in the uniform gray of the wet gravel. A cardboard box soaked through and collapsing under the relentless sleet. Most guys would have kept driving. Just roadside trash. Maybe someone lost a load or just tossed a beer case. But Lucas, his training was to spot anything out of place in his sector. A box doesn't just fall perfectly upright, and it damn sure doesn't twitch on its own against the wind. He slowed the truck, the rear fishtailing for a second on the ice before the tires caught. He pulled over the hazard lights clicking on, throwing a pulsing amber heartbeat into the gloom. Lucas pulled the zipper of his canvas jacket to his chin and stepped out. The sleet bit his face like shrapnel. He moved toward the box, his boots grinding on the icy gravel. And as he drew closer, he heard it. A sound so faint the wind almost stole it away. A whimper, high, desperate, and already fading into nothing. Lucas dropped to one knee, tearing open the saturated flaps of the box. Inside, huddled against a cold corner of wet newspaper, was a shivering ball of black fur no bigger than his fist. A puppy. A German shepherd far too young to be away from its mother. It was soaked to the bone, its little body shaking so hard it vibrated through the cardboard. Its eyes were sealed shut, matted together by the freezing cold and utter exhaustion. Damn it! Lucas breathed the word, a ghost on the wind. The curse was a hollow sound against the cruelty of what someone had done. He didn't hesitate. He just reached in his large, calloused hands, gently scooping the puppy up. It was terrifyingly light, like holding nothing at all. A fragile block of ice wrapped in fur. He unzipped his jacket and tucked the puppy inside, pressing the freezing creature against the warm flannel of his shirt right over his own heart. He scrambled back to the truck, adrenaline burning through his veins. Inside the cab, he blasted the heater on high. He glanced down inside his jacket. Two glassy, unfocused blue eyes blinked open. The tiny pup let out a weak, sputtering cough. "Just hang on, little guy," Lucas muttered, slamming the truck into gear. "We're almost back to the fob." When he burst through the cabin door 20 minutes later, Ranger was there waiting. His older shepherd, now about 6 months old and finally filling out, stood near the hearth. He'd healed mostly, but a slight hitch in his gait always remained, a permanent reminder of the trap that almost took him. His ears perked, his sharp eyes expecting dinner, or maybe the nightly patrol of their perimeter. Instead, he watched Lucas hurry to the kitchen table and pull a soaking, squeaking thing from inside his coat. Ranger's hackles shot up. A low growl rumbled deep in his chest. This was his cabin, his rug, his man. Lucas paid the growl no mind. He was in triage mode. He grabbed a dry towel and started vigorously rubbing the tiny pup, desperate to get the circulation going. The puppy cried out a sharp, piercing sound that grated on every last nerve. Ranger approached, his legs stiff with warning. He sniffed the air, his lip curling. The intruder smelled of soggy cardboard, of fear, and of giving up. Ranger barked a sharp, commanding sound that meant quiet. "Knock it off, Ranger," Lucas snapped without looking up from his task. "Stand down." Ranger huffed a wounded sound and retreated to his rug. He rested his chin on his paws, watching with narrowed, resentful eyes as Lucas Harrison, his soldier who could field strip a rifle in total darkness. He fumbled with a bag of cotton and a carton of milk. In this strange new territory, Lucas was utterly out of his depth. He'd dressed gunshot wounds, set shattered bones, and navigated through fields sown with death. But he had no idea how to deliver life into a creature too small to even drink from a bowl. He mixed some warm milk with a dash of sugar and an egg yolk, a hazy memory of a remedy his grandmother once spoke of. He tried a spoon, but the puppy just thrashed, spilling the precious liquid across the table. He dipped a finger in the milk. The puppy sucked for a heartbeat, then turned its head away, whimpering. "Come on, little soldier, work with me," Lucas pleaded, sweat beading on his brow despite the biting cold. "You have to take this." He finally unearthed an old eyedropper in a first aid kit. For the next hour, the kitchen transformed into a war zone of spilled milk and quiet desperation. Lucas cradled the pup in the crook of his arm, his giant, scarred hand enveloping the fragile animal, carefully dispensing drops into its tiny, desperate mouth. From the shadows of the living room, Ranger watched the entire ordeal with the quiet disdain of a combat veteran, observing a new recruit who didn't know which way to point his weapon. Lucas named him Ekko. It just seemed to fit. He was a small, echoing cry in the vast, crushing silence of the mountains, a tiny life that had somehow rebounded from the void. By 2200 hours, the cabin was shrouded in darkness. The storm outside had eased into a steady, soul-chilling drizzle. Lucas made a nest in a cardboard box near the heater, lining it with his best wool sweater, a sacrifice not made lightly. He laid Echo inside. The puppy was full warm and finally silent. Lucas collapsed onto his bed, feeling an exhaustion that no mission, no march had ever inflicted. He fell asleep to the mournful sound of the wind whispering a silent prayer that the little one would see the dawn. But the mountain cold is a predator at night, the kind that bleeds through the floorboards and finds every single crack in the walls. Around 0300, the fire dwindled to its last embers. The temperature inside the cabin plummeted. Lucas jolted awake. It wasn't a sound that woke him. It was that old buried instinct, the alarm that screamed the perimeter had been breached. He lay perfectly still, listening. And then he heard it, the faint, desperate chatter of teeth. He sat up, dragging a hand across his tired face. He grabbed his flashlight, swinging his legs from the bed. Its beam tore through the blackness of the living room, finding the box by the heater. It was empty. A cold, sharp spear of panic pierced his chest. He swept the light across the floorboards. Had the pup wandered off, fallen into a vent somewhere? "Echko," he whispered. He aimed the beam toward the front door. He could feel the draft from there, a thin blade of freezing air that whistled under the frame. It was the coldest, most vulnerable spot in the house, and that's where they were. Echko had evidently managed to climb out of his box, confused and searching for heat, but had instead wandered directly into the path of the draft. The puppy was curled into a tight, shivering ball right by the door's threshold, trembling so violently he looked like he was seizing. But he wasn't alone. Ranger was there. The old dog had left his own comfortable, warm rug by the dying fire. He was lying parallel to the door, pressing his own body hard against the crack, using his own back as a living, breathing barrier. He had put himself between the killing cold and the puppy. But that wasn't all. Ranger's tail, that magnificent, bushy plume of fur, was draped over the trembling puppy like the heaviest, warmest blanket. Echo had burrowed his nose deep into Ranger's side, drawing warmth from the older dog's belly. But Ranger was on watch. His head was raised, sharp and alert, his eyes scanning the shadows. When the flashlight's beam found him, he didn't utter a growl. He didn't offer a single wag. He met Lucas's gaze with a grave, tired expression. His eyes flickered to the shivering bundle beside him, and then returned to Lucas. The look was unmistakable. He's a liability, he's loud, he smells like milk, but he's one of us. Lucas just stood there in his boxers and t-shirt, the flashlight wavering in his grip. He felt a hard knot forming in his throat, a familiar ache. He remembered the men he'd served with, how they would pack into a foxhole together, sharing body heat and a silent terror because it was the only way to make it to sunrise. "Good watch, Ranger," Lucas rasped, his voice thick with emotion. "Good watch." He clicked off the light, plunging them back into the protective dark. He wouldn't move the pup back to his box. He knew you don't interfere with the established chain of command. Ranger was on duty. The unit was secure. Lucas returned to his bed, yanking the heavy comforter to his chin. The cabin air was still frigid, but for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, it wasn't empty. Winter finally surrendered the valley, leaving a terrain of mud. The first hints of wild flowers and a sky so profoundly blue it felt like a fresh wound. The crushing silence that had been Lucas Harrison's relentless shadow had finally moved on. In its place, a chaotic new life had taken over. A cadence of thumping tails, scrabbling claws, and the quiet, conspiring snorts of two partners planning their next move. The cabin was no longer a sterile memorial to his past. It was a training ground, and its drill sergeant was Ranger. Echo was growing impossibly fast. The small ball of black fur that once fit into a shoebox was now a gangly, goofy adolescent of 4 months. All legs and oversized ears that he hadn't grown into yet. He was clumsy and overeager and had the attention span of a hummingbird, but he absolutely revered Ranger. Wherever the older shepherd moved, Echo trailed him, stepping into his paw prints, mirroring his head tilts, trying with all his might to look as battle-hardened as his big brother. Ranger, now almost a year old and settled into his formidable frame, approached his duties as a mentor with utter seriousness. He wasn't merely raising a sibling, he was forging a fellow operator. The training started with Stealth Operations 101. Lucas watched the whole thing unfold over his morning coffee. Ranger would glide across the hardwood floor of the main room, his gait liquid and silent, planting his paws with precision to bypass the creaky floorboard by the hall. Then he would freeze and glance back at Echo. Echo would attempt to replicate the move. Click-clack slide, whoomp. The pup would trip over his own feet, his nails scratching against the wood like a frantic tap dancer. Ranger would let out a long, suffering exhale through his nose. He'd walk back, give Echo a firm nudge on the shoulder with his snout, and demonstrate once more. Shift your weight. Land softly, stay focused. By the time late spring arrived, Echo could move like a wisp of smoke. Lucas began finding the puppy in rooms he never heard him enter, curled beneath the kitchen table as Lucas ate his breakfast, or sitting perfectly still behind the shower curtain, observing Lucas brush his teeth. Next came advanced strategic requisition, or as Lucas had started calling it, where in the hell did my other sock go? It began with small things. A lost remote control discovered buried under Echo's toys, a single glove. Beneath the sofa, he found his good work glove, a stark contrast to the usual tattered offerings from Ranger. Lucas understood exactly what was unfolding. He caught the silent, knowing glances passing between them. He watched Ranger feign innocence by the door as Echo crept by, cheeks puffed with contraband. The old gunny in him, the man who demanded perfect corners, would have crushed this little insurgency in an instant. There'd be corrections, the perimeter would be locked down, and discipline restored. But the Lucas of today just watched. He even started leaving things out intentionally. A frayed tennis ball on a low shelf, a worn towel draped over a chair. He'd settle into his armchair newspaper held high, peeking over the edge, waiting for the curtain to rise. It was pure theater with Ranger as the mastermind, the lookout. He'd take up a post by the window, his ears pivoting like radar arrays, scanning for the primary threat, Lucas making eye contact. Echo was the operator. He'd low-crawl across the carpet, acquire the target, and exfil to their bunker behind the recliner. The house pulsed with life. It felt like a barracks full of young Marines letting loose. It finally felt like a home. But their true final exam at the Academy of Thieves arrived with the heat of June, a mission for the holy grail of all canine conquests, the refrigerator. For weeks, Lucas had noted his supplies dwindling. The targets weren't just socks any longer. It was cheese, that specific block of sharp cheddar on the fridge's bottom shelf. Then the deli turkey vanished, followed impossibly by a tub of butter he discovered in the living room, its lid pried off, the inside licked clean. He inspected the refrigerator's seal. It was heavy and magnetic. No way a dog could just nudge this open. A human intruder. Impossible. "All right, you two, what about the cheddar?" Lucas asked one night, staring down at the duo. Ranger became a statue, frozen in place, suddenly engrossed in cleaning a paw. Echo flopped onto his back, sneezed, and played the adorable idiot. "Yeah, right," Lucas grumbled. "Plausible deniability." The very next day, he drove into town for a small, motion-activated trail cam. He secured it atop the kitchen cabinets, aimed squarely at the refrigerator. "Trust but verify," he murmured, the old Reagan line echoing in his head. 2 days later, he sat at his laptop to see the truth. A warm mug of coffee in his hand, half expecting to find a faulty latch or maybe some impossibly clever raccoon that had figured out the lock. He hit play. The footage flickered to life, grainy and colorless, time-stamped at 10:42 in the morning. He'd been outside splitting firewood at that very second. The kitchen was clear. Then Ranger entered the frame, not just wandering in. He methodically swept the room. He cleared the back door. He secured the entrance from the hall. He looked right toward the window, confirming Lucas's position in the yard. The area was secure. Ranger gave a soft bark. Echo exploded into view, his tail whipping so furiously his whole body swayed. He made a direct line for the fridge, pawing in vain at the slick white surface. He glanced back at Ranger with a questioning whine. Phase 2 commenced. Ranger approached the fridge. He didn't bother to scratch. He turned sideways, planting his paws wide and firm, bracing his powerful shoulder against the doorframe, forming an unyielding anchor. He then lowered his head, his broad, muscular back becoming a perfect ramp. Lucas leaned in, his eyes glued to the screen, his coffee now forgotten. "No way," he whispered. On the screen, Echo was scrambling up, placing his paws first on Ranger's hips, then his shoulders. He was so unsteady, his claws digging for purchase in Ranger's dense fur. Yet Ranger didn't even flinch. He stood like a stone monument, bearing the full weight of his young apprentice. Echo was now raised, standing on his hind legs on Ranger's broad back, wobbling dangerously. He stretched out with his front paws. He swiped at the handle and missed. He swiped again, another miss. Then Echo did something truly brilliant. He hooked his left paw inside the vertical handle and leaned back, using his entire body weight as leverage. For a heartbeat, the magnetic seal fought back. Then a soft pop. The door swung wide. Echo lost his footing, tumbling from Ranger's back and landing in a clumsy heap on the cold linoleum. But the objective had been achieved. Mission accomplished. The golden glow from the refrigerator spilled across the floor like treasure from a pirate's chest. Both dogs suddenly froze, staring toward the window. A heavy silence. And then the plunder began. It wasn't a mad scramble. It was a precise surgical strike. Ranger was the first to move in. He assessed the vegetable drawer with a sniff, dismissing it. He did the same with the milk, ignoring it completely. He reached deep onto the bottom shelf, his jaws closing gently around a package of Johnsonville bratwursts. He pulled it free and set it on the floor. Echo plunged in next, emerging with a bag of shredded mozzarella. Ranger nudged the refrigerator door with his snout, not closing it completely. He wasn't trying to be polite, but pushed it just enough so it wasn't left wide open. Then the two of them seized their prizes. Ranger with his sausages, Echo with his cheese. They trotted out of the kitchen, marching side by side, their tails held high, disappearing into the living room to claim the spoils of their war. Lucas hit pause. He sat there in the cabin's deep silence, staring at the frozen image of his two dogs, the scarred old veteran and the orphaned recruit, operating in absolute perfect criminal harmony. A feeling bubbled deep in his chest, a sound rusty and utterly unfamiliar. It began as a rough huff, grew into a low chuckle, then finally broke free in a deep, belly-shaking laugh. He laughed until his ribs began to ache. He laughed until tears forced their way from the corners of his eyes, tracing paths down his weathered cheeks. He laughed at how absurd it was, at how intelligent it was, at the undeniable, untamable force of life in it. He felt no anger. How could he ever be angry? He had dedicated years to training men to function as a single unit, to conquer obstacles, to adapt, and to overcome. He had built a squad, and now they were simply applying his lessons to unsanctioned targets. Lucas wiped at his eyes and looked down. Ranger and Echo were now sitting at his feet, drawn by the sound of his laughter. They both looked concerned. Ranger canted his head, his ears sharp with focus. Echo rested his chin softly on Lucas's knee. "You two," Lucas said, his voice thick with an overwhelming affection. "Are going to the brig?" Ranger thumped his tail once. He recognized the tone. He was not in trouble. Lucas reached down, ruffling Ranger's ears before scratching Echo's chest. "But that was some damn fine technique," Lucas whispered to them. "Solid teamwork." He never put a child lock on the fridge that night. He figured if they could work that hard for a bratwurst, then they had more than earned it. Besides Lucas Harrison, the man who once counted every minute until sundown just to see the day die, suddenly realized he couldn't recall the last time he'd even glanced at the clock. He was far too busy watching the show. That summer in the High Rockies finally burned away in a final blaze of golden aspens and fire-red maples. A chill settled in the air, thick with the scent of wood smoke and decaying leaves. This had always been Lucas Harrison's favorite time of year, a season of stark beauty that braced you for the long, quiet winter. But not this year. This year, the changing seasons carried a darkness that no roaring fire could ever hope to keep at bay. Echo was 7 months old now, finally growing into his paws, shedding the clumsy fluff of a puppy for the sleek, powerful frame of an adolescent. His ears now stood tall and alert, and a sharp intelligence was dawning in his eyes, one that was beginning to rival Rangers. Their so-called Academy of Thieves was thriving, the pair pulling off heists with distraction techniques that would have made a Special Forces team nod in approval. But on one Tuesday morning in late October, the game ended. Lucas rattled the kibble into their steel bowls. It was a sound that normally triggered a four-legged stampede. Ranger trotted over, his tail keeping a slow, measured beat. But Echo never came. Lucas frowned. "Echo, chow time." Silence answered. He found the young dog huddled under the porch, a place he only sought refuge when the thunder cracked the sky open. Echo was shivering, despite the mildness of the day. When Lucas reached down, the dog's nose was hot and dry, and his gums were a pale, deathly gray. "Hey, buddy," Lucas whispered, that old familiar dread tightening its grip on his stomach. "What is it?" Echo tried to lift his head to offer a lick, but the effort alone seemed to drain him. He let out a faint whimper, and his eyes drifted shut. Then his body retched in a violent, heaving spasm that brought up nothing but yellow bile. Lucas didn't waste a second. He scooped the 70-pound dog into his arms as if he were still that tiny puppy from the cardboard box, and laid him in the truck's passenger seat, barking an order for Ranger to stay behind. The drive to town was a frantic blur of speed and suffocating fear. Doctor Sarah Miller was a woman who had seen it all. A large, no-nonsense vet with short gray hair and hands that were both firm and impossibly gentle. She was the one who had helped his old dog Gunner find peace 3 years ago. She knew Lucas. She knew he did not break easily. But when he stormed into her clinic cradling the limp shepherd, she saw the sheer terror etched in his eyes. She worked fast running the tests while the waiting room clock ticked with an agonizing slowness. When she finally came back out, her expression was grave. "It's Parvo Lucas," she said, her voice low. "There's a vicious outbreak in the county. It hits the young dogs the hardest. He's vaccinated," Lucas said, his own voice sounding distant and hollow. "No vaccine is 100% effective," she replied, with a gentle sorrow. "And with his rough start, he was malnourished weak. His immune system is just crashing." She then explained the prognosis. It was a battle report from hell. Echo was already severely dehydrated. He was bleeding internally. His organs were under siege. She offered to keep him there, but warned Lucas that they were slammed by the outbreak, and no one would be there to watch him through the night. Lucas looked at the cold metal cage in the back room. It looked too much like a cell, a place to be abandoned. "Give me the fluids," Lucas said, his voice hardening into steel. "Give me the medication. I'm taking him home." Dr. Miller stared at him. She saw the combat medic in him taking over. "Lucas, this is going to be brutal. He needs IV's anti-nausea meds, constant monitoring. If his fever spikes—" "I was a gunnery sergeant, Doc," Lucas interrupted, his eyes like stone. "I have kept men alive with less than a bag of saline and a prayer. Give me the gear." She saw his unwavering resolve, then nodded and began to pack a box with IV bags, catheters, syringes, and antibiotics. Keep him warm, keep the fluids going. If he could just make it to day 4, he would have a fighting chance. Back at the cabin, our living room had become a field hospital. Lucas laid down plastic sheeting across the rug, covering it with clean towels. He rigged the IV bag to the stand of a floor lamp. He shaved a small patch on Echo's fragile leg and slid the catheter in with steady, practiced hands. Echo didn't even struggle. He was far too weak. He just lay there, his breaths coming in shallow, rapid bursts, his small body limp, Ranger knew. The older dog paced the perimeter of the blanket like a sentry. He sniffed Echo's face, whining softly. When Echo gave no response, Ranger retreated to a corner of the room. He refused to touch his dinner. He refused the call to go outside. He simply lay with his great head on his paws, his eyes fixed on his fading brother, letting out low, mournful whimpers that sounded like a creature in true physical agony. The first night was a living nightmare of fluids and constant cleanup. The virus was relentless. Echo's tiny body was expelling everything, as if turning itself inside out. The smell, that distinct metallic scent of parvo, soon filled the small cabin. By the second night, a crushing exhaustion began to set in. Lucas sat on the floor next to Echo, his back pressed against the sofa. His eyes burned. Every time he dared to close them, he didn't see the cabin. He saw the desert. He saw the dust. He saw Gunnar lying there in the sand, bleeding out from a sniper's shot. A memory that wasn't real. A hallucination born from a place of deep guilt. Gunnar had died of cancer, but in the battlefield of Lucas's mind, it felt like a complete failure of protection. "You let him die," a voice whispered in his head. "And you're going to let this one die too. You are cursed, Lucas. Everything you love turns to ash." Suddenly, Echo's breathing hitched. His heart rate was a frantic, erratic flutter. He looked like a tiny skeleton draped in a coat of dull, lifeless fur. The light in his eyes was fading, retreating down a long, dark tunnel. Lucas glanced at the clock. 0300 hours, the witching hour, the hour when most soldiers finally gave up the ghost. Lucas felt that cold despair rising in his throat, a black tide threatening to pull him under. It would be so easy to just let go, to accept that nature was a cruel force, to call Dr. Miller, and finally end the suffering. He looked at Ranger. The older dog had crawled forward on his belly. He was licking Echo's cold ear, desperate to stir some sign of life. Lucas slammed his fist down on the floor. "No," he growled, the sound raw. He pushed himself up, his knees cracking. He grabbed a fresh bag of fluids. He checked the IV line. He grabbed a syringe of electrolyte solution. He knelt down and gently lifted Echo's head. The puppy's neck was completely limp. "Listen to me," Lucas commanded, his voice suddenly, the one that had screamed over the roar of mortar fire. "Echo, eyes on me." The puppy's eyelids fluttered a faint response. "You are a Marine's dog," Lucas said, his own voice cracking, but fierce. "We do not quit. We do not surrender. You hear me? I did not pull you out of that snow just so I could bury you in the mud." He injected the vital fluids. He gently wiped the puppy's face with a warm cloth. He wrapped him snugly in a heated blanket. "Gunny doesn't leave anyone behind," Lucas whispered, leaning his forehead against Echo's fever-hot skull. "Not Gunnar, not you. No one gets left behind. That is the vow. Do you hear me, Private? That is the order." And he did not sleep. He stayed awake through the entire third day and into the long third night. He forced water drop by single drop into Echo's mouth. He monitored the IV drip. He spoke to Echo, constantly telling him stories of the Corps' stories of Ranger's quiet and steady bravery. He wove tales of the mountains, his voice a lifeline, tethering the young dog to the world of the living. Ranger remained a steadfast shadow at his side. Together, the weary soldier and his faithful guardian forged a bulwark against the encroaching darkness. Dawn broke on the fourth day, cloaked in a silence so profound it was terrifying. Lucas, having drifted off for just a second, sat slumped with his head on his chest. He jolted awake, his heart pounding against his ribs. Echo was unnervingly still. Lucas reached out a trembling hand, steeling himself to check for a pulse. He held his breath, bracing for the cold, final reality of death. And then he felt it. A faint thump, thump, thump. It grew stronger, slower, finding a rhythm. Echo exhaled a long, deep sigh. His nose twitched. Then slowly, almost painfully, one golden eye fluttered open, followed by the other. The glassy, vacant look was gone. His eyes were weak, but they were clear. Echo managed to lift his head maybe an inch from the towel. His gaze found Lucas, and with the last ounce of his strength he stretched out his pink tongue and gently licked the soldier's thumb. It was just a faint, dry lick, but to Lucas it was the most profound sensation he'd ever known. "Hey there," Lucas whispered, his voice cracking. The very tip of Echo's tail managed a single weak thump on the wooden floor. At the sound, Ranger rose to his feet. He padded over, sniffed Echo's face with great purpose, and then unleashed a single, sharp bark of pure joy that echoed through the rafters. He began to clean Echo's face with devoted licks as if washing away the last traces of sickness. Lucas finally let himself lean back against the sofa. The adrenaline that had fueled him for 72 straight hours suddenly drained away, leaving him feeling utterly hollow. He watched the sun stream through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the morning light. He stared down at his own hands. They were shaking uncontrollably, and then the dam finally broke. Lucas Harrison, the man who was a rock, the gunny who never broke, buried his face in his hands, and finally he wept. This wasn't just crying. He sobbed, his entire body racked with the force of his grief. He sobbed for Gunnar. He sobbed for the brothers he'd lost in the war. He sobbed for all the years of crushing loneliness he'd endured in this cabin. And he sobbed from the overwhelming gratitude of seeing a life pulled back from the very brink. He remained on the floor for a long, long time, the tears streaming between his fingers as Ranger sat beside him, pressing his heavy frame against Lucas's shoulder, offering the only comfort the loyal dog knew how to give. The soldier had honored his promise. The squad was still whole. March in the Mountains was a beautiful liar. It would promise spring with blinding crystal blue mornings that melted the frost from the glass, only to become treacherous by noon when the thawing snows made the very ground beneath your feet unstable. It was mud season, that time of year when the Rockies were at their most volatile. The earth itself was a slurry of ice water and shifting shale, just waiting for one wrong step to send it all crashing down. Lucas Harrison knew these dangers well. He patrolled the edge of his property with caution, his boots sinking deep into the cold slush. Ranger and Echo, now a truly formidable pair of guardians, moved with him, trotting just ahead. Echo's recovery had been nothing short of a miracle. The sickness that almost took him months before seemed to have burned away every last trace of his earlier hesitation. He was nearly 2 years old now, a magnificent animal with a deep mahogany and black coat. Where Ranger was the stoic sentinel, calculating every move, Echo had become the very spirit of the mountains themselves. He was wild, full of boundless energy, and owned a heart that seemed far too big for his chest. They were now approaching the ridgeline, a jagged spine of rock that fell away into a deep ravine they called Devil's Drop. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp stone. Then Echo froze mid-stride. His head jerked left, his ears pivoting like radar dishes. His frame went rigid, muscles coiling like steel cables beneath his fur. He uttered a single sharp bark, and Lucas stopped dead. "What is it, boy?" Ranger had stopped as well, tasting the air, but his eyes were fixed on Lucas. Ranger was a soldier awaiting his command. Echo was different. He acted on instinct. A faint sound drifted from the ravine below, a cry thin and laced with terror, carried upon the wind. "Help! Someone help!" Before Lucas could even inhale to shout a command, Echo exploded into motion. He didn't just run, he launched himself. He ripped through the undergrowth, heedless of the thorns tearing at his fur, hurtling straight for the precipice. "Echo, hold!" Lucas roared the command, cracking like a bullwhip. But the order, which was usually absolute, was completely ignored. The instinct to rescue, the very drive he saw that first night in the snow, had taken complete control. Lucas scrambled after him, slipping in the wet earth. "Ranger, heel!" His other dog had started to bolt, but at the command he dug in, skidding to a stop. His gaze flickered from Lucas to Echo's vanishing tail, letting out a frustrated, high-pitched whine. Lucas seized Ranger's collar, his trembling fingers fumbling to snap the leash on. He couldn't afford to risk both of them. This edge was too unstable. "Stay with me," Lucas panted, wrapping the leash tightly around his wrist. Together they raced for the drop-off. When he saw it, Lucas's stomach plummeted. The ravine was a horrifying maw of crumbling shale and rotting ice. About 50 feet below, a man was clinging desperately to a gnarled root of an ancient pine. He was young, his bright orange parka a violent slash of color against the gray stone. He'd clearly slipped from the trail above, and was now dangling over a chasm that disappeared into the swirling mist. And then he saw Echo. The dog had somehow navigated the treacherous slope with the sure-footedness of a mountain goat. He stood on a narrow ledge just 10 feet above the terrified hiker, barking in a steady, deliberate rhythm. The deep, booming sound echoed through the canyon, a living beacon. It was their trained distress signal, 2 barks, a pause, 2 barks. He was marking his position. "I see him," Lucas shouted down, cupping his hands. "Don't move, I'm calling it in." The hiker glanced up, his face pale and streaked with tears. "I can't hold on much longer. The root is breaking." Lucas ripped the radio from his belt. Old habits truly died hard. He never entered the woods without comms. He keyed the emergency channel. "Mayday, mayday, this is Gunny Harrison at Devil's Drop. I have a civilian trapped on the cliff face. Grade 3 incline requesting immediate assistance." While waiting for the static of a reply, Lucas's eyes were fixed on his dog. Echo wasn't moving. The ledge beneath him was actively crumbling, sending a shower of pebbles down into the void. Instead, Echo flattened himself, inching his head over the edge and whining softly to the man. He was keeping him focused, telling him, "I am here with you. You are not alone." Meanwhile, Ranger, tethered to a tree on the ridge, was going absolutely frantic. He strained at the end of his leash, rising onto his hind legs, barking a desperate, non-stop warning. He sensed something Lucas in his focus on the man hadn't yet noticed. The snowpack directly above the hiker was groaning. The warmth of the day had loosened the very ice that held the entire rock face together. A jagged crack split the mud, a terrifying fissure right above where Echo held his ground. "Echo, recall!" Lucas screamed the command, tearing his throat raw. "Get away from there!" Echo glanced up, acknowledging the command. His eyes found Lucas's, a silent understanding passing between them before he looked back to the man whose fingers were failing. The dog had made his choice. He would not leave. Moments later, the air was torn apart by the sound of the approaching rescue helicopter. It was a rhythmic pulse that should have meant salvation. A basket descended from the sky. The downdraft from the rotors whipped the snow into a blinding fury. "Take the basket!" Lucas yelled. The hiker reached out a desperate hand, his fingers scrabbling against the metal cage. He swung a leg over, tumbling inside, just as the precarious hold he was on snapped like a rifle shot. "He's clear, pull up," Lucas shouted into the radio. The basket rose. The hiker was safe. And then the entire mountain groaned and gave way. It began with a low rumble, a deep tremor that Lucas felt through the very soles of his boots. Then the crack came the sound of the earth itself ripping apart. "Echo!" Lucas lunged forward, a single desperate instinct. The leash snapped taut as Ranger threw himself backward, a reflex anchoring Lucas from the precipice. The ledge where Echo stood simply ceased to exist. Tons of rock mud and sodden snow sheared from the face of the mountain. This wasn't a slide, it was a complete and total collapse. One moment he was there, a stark black and tan silhouette against the bleak gray rock. The next, he was swallowed whole by a churning maelstrom of snow and debris. "No!" The scream was ripped from Lucas's chest, a raw, primal agony. He watched, powerless, as the avalanche thundered into the darkness of the ravine. The roar was deafening, shaking the trees to their roots, shaking the ground, shaking Lucas to his very core. And then, silence. The dust settled in a slow gray curtain. The helicopter hovered for a long moment. Then it banked, and flew on the pilot completely unaware that a member of the team had just been lost to the mountain. Lucas scrambled down the slope farther than was safe, sliding on his rear, ripping his jeans, and tearing his hands raw against the stone. Ranger fought to keep up, whining, digging his claws into the mud, a living anchor against the fall. "Echo!" Lucas screamed his name. "Echo!" His voice shattered against the canyon walls. "Echo! Echo! Echo!" The name returned to him, a hollow, mocking sound. There was no answering bark, no stirring in the massive tomb of rubble far below, only the steady drip of water and the wind whispering through the pines. Lucas spent the next 6 hours in a desperate search. He and Ranger navigated a narrow deer trail down to the bottom of the ravine. They scrambled over boulders the size of automobiles. They dug through deep mounds of wet snow with their bare hands and paws. Ranger worked without rest. He nosed into every crevice, every pile of loose shale. He barked into the darkness of holes, listening, waiting for a sign that never came. The scent was lost, muddled by the water and the sheer scale of the landslide. By sunset, the temperature began to plummet. The mud started to freeze solid into iron-hard ruts. Lucas stood at the bottom of Devil's Drop, covered in mud, his hands bleeding, his chest heaving with exhaustion. He looked up at the raw scar on the mountain face. It was a tombstone. Ranger sank into the snow. In another world he would have stood guard, but he was utterly spent. He let out a long, keening howl, a sound of pure grief that rose through the trees and pierced the darkening sky. It was not a call for the pack. It was a eulogy. Lucas collapsed to his knees. This time he didn't cry. This wasn't the emotional relief of the parvo recovery. This was the cold, numbing shock of combat loss. It was the gut-wrenching feeling of counting heads on the chopper and coming up one short. "I'm sorry," Lucas choked out to the void. "I'm so sorry." He secured the leash to Ranger's collar. He couldn't bear to lose the only soul he had left. The ascent was a slow, agonizing ordeal. Each step away from that chasm felt like a profound betrayal, but the blackness was complete and the cold lethal. Arriving at the cabin, the silence that met them was more crushing than it had ever been. The food bowls remained on the floor from that morning. 2 bowls. Lucas reached for Echo's. It rattled violently in his trembling hand. He set it on the counter, face down. He sank into his armchair, gazing at the unlit fireplace as Ranger rested his head on his knee. A deep sigh shuddering through his massive chest. The hiker was safe, tucked away warm in a hospital bed, probably recounting the tale of a courageous dog. But back in the cabin, their hero was gone. The little thief who'd stolen his heart had been reclaimed by the mountain, and the ghost in the storm was now a ghost for good. Time in the mountains is often tracked by the sun's journey or the turning of the leaves. But for Lucas Harrison, the past 21 days were measured in crushing silences and hollow spaces. 3 weeks, 504 hours since the mountain opened its maw and devoured the squad's youngest member. The cabin, once a haven of solitude, then a barracks of joyful chaos, had transformed once more. Now it was a tomb. The silence was nothing like the peaceful quiet of his early retirement. It was a suffocating pressure, a weight against his eardrums. The silence of a missing note in a perfect chord, rendering the entire melody dissonant and broken. Lucas clung to a routine, but it was a fragile one. He'd wake up. He'd make coffee. He'd feed Ranger. But he moved like a man wading through deep, heavy water. Ranger, though, seemed to be taking it even harder. The proud German shepherd had lost his drill instructor's swagger. He no longer made his round's tail held high and proud. He moved with his head hung low, ears pinned flat against his skull. He ate just enough to get by, leaving his bowl half full, as if hoping that by saving it, his brother might return to claim his share. But the most gut-wrenching ritual began each morning at 0800. Ranger would pad over to the toy basket in the living room. He'd nose past the tennis balls and knotted ropes until he located his prize, the old tattered gardening glove. The very same kind of glove he'd used months before to bargain his way into Lucas's world. Now it was a sacred charm. Ranger would carry the glove with immense care, stepping out onto the porch. He would then place it on the top step, precisely where Echo always loved to sunbathe, and then he would take up his post beside it, staring out at the tree line, his amber eyes fixed and unblinking, waiting for that black and tan blur to explode from the woods. He'd wait for hours on end. Occasionally, a soft woof would escape him, a question carried on the wind. "Are you coming? The toll has been paid. Come on home." Lucas couldn't stand to watch, so he searched. Every single day at first light, Lucas would gear up. He approached it like a recon mission deep in enemy territory. He'd don his tactical vest, carry a hydration pack and climbing rope, along with a heavy-duty trekking pole. He never took Ranger. The terrain was far too treacherous. He couldn't risk his only remaining family. He meticulously scoured the base of the ravine. He navigated treacherous piles of unstable debris through shifting landscapes of shale and mud. He scoured the creek beds, peered into the hollows of ancient trees. "Echo!" he'd cry out, his voice raw from the thin, dry mountain air. "Here, boy." But only the jeering caw of crows and the river's cold rush answered back. On the 12th day, a flicker of hope. He was nearly 3 miles downstream from Devil's Drop, in a tangled maze of underbrush and jagged limestone. He had pushed deeper than ever before, compelled by something primal in his gut. Or maybe it was just the sharp edge of desperation. There, beneath a rocky overhang forming a shallow, natural cave, the ground was disturbed. Lucas dropped to his knees, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He drew his flashlight, cutting the shadows with its beam. No paw prints. The ground was a bed of unforgiving rock. But in the deepest corner, a small, stark pile of bones. Lucas pushed himself inside the damp chill and tight space, meaning nothing. He studied the remains. They belonged to a snowshoe hare. They were fresh, maybe 2 days old. But it wasn't the bones that stole the air from Lucas's lungs. It was how they'd been picked clean. A coyote or a wolf would have shattered them, for the marrow leaving only splintered fragments behind. A bear would have swallowed the creature whole, but these were meticulously stripped, the meat carved away with an impossible precision. The smaller bones were left untouched. It was a learned skill. Lucas squeezed his eyes shut as a memory flooded his mind, sharp as a field manual illustration. It was the Academy of Ranger. He could see his old partner in the yard with a rabbit, a lesson in survival. Ranger hadn't torn it apart. He'd pinned it with one massive paw, stripping the meat with deliberate care, eating methodically. And Echo had watched him, a silent apprentice, his head tilted, mimicking every move with a ragged chew toy. "You learned," Lucas whispered, his voice shaking with the revelation. "You listened to him." His eyes darted around, searching. Then he saw it, a tuft of black fur snagged on a thorn bush near the mouth of the cave. He worked it between his fingers, the coarse, double-coated fur of a shepherd. "He's alive." Lucas breathed out the words, a prayer answered. The phrase was like cool water on a parched tongue. "He's alive." For the entire next week, Lucas relentlessly patrolled that sector. He left caches of food. He left his own worn shirts, praying the familiar scent would finally guide Echo home. He whistled their recall command until his lips cracked and grew numb. But Echo was a ghost, driven by the survival instincts Ranger had hammered into him. He was taught to stay hidden, to evade any threat. The student had become a master of the unseen, so skilled that he was now evading the one man who meant him no harm. Then the sky above began to darken to the color of a fresh bruise. A late spring storm was brewing, the kind the old-timers here called a widowmaker. It wouldn't bring snow, it would bring a deluge of rain, a freezing torrential downpour that fell in solid sheets, transforming the frozen ground into a treacherous, impassable mire. It began on the 19th day. Lucas was deep in the forest when the sky ripped open. The temperature plunged, turning the hammering rain into a blinding onslaught of sleet, encasing the entire world in a shell of treacherous ice. Lucas fought to press on, but his feet went out, sending him crashing down hard on his bad shoulder. He slid a terrifying 10 feet down an embankment. He clawed his way back up, mud and grit filling his eyes and his mouth. "Echo!" he screamed into the howling gale. But the wind only screamed back louder and more furious. Visibility vanished, plunging him into a gray nothingness as the creeks began to swell, exploding into raging torrents of brown water, ripping ancient trees from their very banks. He had to retreat. To stay meant freezing to death, and Echo would be truly, completely alone. The storm raged for 3 long days, pounding the cabin roof like the final solemn drumroll of an execution. Lucas wore a path in the floor. The relentless rain on the glass, a mirror to the truth washing away outside. The downpour was erasing everything: the scent markers, the faint tracks, the stray tufts of fur. And with them, his hope. On the dawn of the 21st day, the storm finally broke, leaving behind a silence that felt sterile, unnervingly clean. Stepping onto the porch, Lucas breathed in the cold air, thick with the scent of wet iron. He stared at the woods. The landscape was rewritten. Fresh gullies scarred the earth where paths once were. Old trees lay defeated. The entire map of his search grid was gone. Ranger emerged and sat beside him without the glove this time. He looked up at Lucas, his muzzle appearing a little more gray. Or perhaps it was just the dim light. He exhaled a heavy sigh, leaning his solid weight against Lucas's leg, not seeking comfort, but offering his own silent support. Lucas sank onto the damp steps, elbows on his knees, his hands clasped together tightly. His mind replayed the vow he'd made in that living room as Echo was fading from Parvo. "Gunny doesn't leave anyone behind." "I failed," Lucas whispered the words like gravel in his throat. "I lost him, Ranger, so I couldn't hold the line." He gazed into the vast, uncaring wilderness. Somewhere in there was a soul that had trusted him completely. A dog who'd learned to raid refrigerators and comfort the dying. Now he was alone. Or worse. The flicker of hope he'd found in the cave was extinguished, swallowed by the mud. Lucas felt the old armor hardening around him again, that stone wall he had built after Gunnar was gone. The impulse was to lock the doors, to draw every single curtain, to never let anything in, because to love something was to have it torn away. He reached down, stroking Ranger's head, his fur damp. "It's just us again, buddy," Lucas said, his voice hollow and flat. "Just the 2 of us now." Ranger remained still, but wouldn't meet his gaze. He kept his eyes locked on the tree line, watching the shadows dance, refusing to believe the squad was broken, even if his commander had just surrendered. The dawn of the 25th day arrived with a cruelty that felt personal. It was a perfect Montana spring morning, the sky a piercing, relentless blue, the sun turning lingering snow patches into blinding diamonds of light. The air carried the scent of wet earth, and new pine, a world reawakening. But for Lucas Harrison, it was just another sunrise in a world that had gone dark. He sat there on the porch steps, a mug of black coffee going cold between his hands. He wasn't drinking it, just holding it for a warmth that never reached him. Ranger sat faithfully beside him. The German Shepherd hadn't brought the glove to the porch in 3 days. He'd stopped scanning the tree line. Now he just sat there, a heavy, silent sentinel guarding the emptiness. His once glossy coat seemed dull. He leaned his weight against Lucas's leg, a constant physical reminder that there were only 2 of them left. "We should fix the fence today," Lucas said, his voice raspy from disuse. "The west pasture's leaning." It was a lie. The fence meant nothing. Nothing did. But a soldier needs a mission, even a pointless one. Ranger didn't stir. He rested his chin on his paws, closing his eyes, in surrender to the sun. Then, it happened. It wasn't a sound, not at first. It was a vibration. Ranger's ears, which had laid flat against his skull, twitched once, then again. In an instant, Ranger's eyes flashed open. Lucas felt the change ripple through the animal before his own eyes registered a thing. Ranger's muscles coiled like springs beneath his fur. The bone-deep weariness that had haunted him for weeks evaporated in a single heartbeat. He rose to his feet, his entire frame taut and unyielding, his muzzle aimed straight for the dense tree line where the shadows lay their darkest. "What is it, boy?" Lucas breathed, his own heart lurching in his chest. "A bear." But Ranger unleashed a sound Lucas hadn't heard in nearly a month. It was not a broken whine, nor a soul-weary howl. It was a true bark, sharp, commanding, and so thunderous it seemed to rattle the very rafters of the porch. Contact front. Ranger didn't wait for an order. He exploded from the porch, sailing over the steps in one fluid, powerful leap, and tore across the muddy yard toward the woods. "Ranger, wait!" Lucas yelled, his coffee splashing. He scrambled upright, ignoring the sharp protest in his bad knee as he ran. He ran with a frantic urgency he hadn't known since the chaos of the evac zone. He watched Ranger hit the edge of the woods and skid to a stop, his tail whipping so fiercely his whole body vibrated with unrestrained joy. Lucas slowed his pace as he drew near, breath ragged and torn in his lungs. He narrowed his eyes, peering into the deep shade of the pines. A flicker of movement, a form peeled away from the darkness. It was gaunt. It dragged itself forward with a heavy limp favoring its right hind leg. Its fur was a tangled mess of burrs, caked mud, and old blood. It looked like a specter pieced together from the debris of the forest floor. But Lucas would know those eyes anywhere. They were a brilliant golden green, still burning with a fierce, unquenchable fire. "Echo!" Lucas choked out the name a shattered whisper. The dog limped into a patch of sunlight. He was skeletal, his ribs a cage beneath his thin coat. He looked utterly spent, battered by the wild, a spirit returned from the very edge of the world. But he was standing. He was moving. Ranger was beside him instantly, not tackling him, but sensing with pure instinct just how fragile his brother was. Instead, Ranger moved around him in a joyful dance, letting out soft, high yips, washing Echo's face and his ears with gentle licks, and his neck. He checked him over with frantic, worried sniffs, nudging him softly as if to confirm, "You're really real. You're here." Echo accepted the loving welcome for a moment, offering Ranger a single weak lick on the muzzle. But then his gaze shifted, looking back toward the woods. He gave a soft, encouraging woof. Lucas froze. What was he seeing? From the shelter of the thorny brush, a second figure emerged. It was a female German shepherd, though she had the haunted, wild look of a wolf. She was smaller than Echo, her pale sable coat a perfect camouflage against the dead grass. She was paralyzed with terror. Her tail was clamped so tightly between her legs it touched her belly. She flinched at Ranger's joyful barks, pressing her body low to the earth as if to disappear. This was a stray, a feral creature that had likely never known a kind hand or a warm fire. Her eyes were fixed on Echo with total desperate trust. In that instant, Lucas understood. Echo hadn't just been surviving for 3 long weeks. He had been leading. Somewhere out in that freezing, God-forsaken ravine, through the storms and the starvation, the student had become the master. Echo had found a soul even more broken than himself, another stray likely lost in that same brutal storm. And he had applied the one lesson Lucas and Ranger had ingrained in him. A gunny never leaves anyone behind. He had kept her alive. He had guided her. And now he was bringing her to the only sanctuary he had ever known. Lucas collapsed to his knees in the cold mud, feeling nothing but the swell in his chest. He opened his arms wide. "Echo," he sobbed. "Come here, boy." Echo met the Marine's gaze. He didn't flee. He carried too much hard-won dignity for that now. He advanced with a slow, deliberate gait, the frightened female a shadow at his flank. Upon reaching Lucas, Echo came to a halt. He looked Lucas square in the eye, a deep, weary wisdom in his stare. Then he opened his jaw. Something landed on the damp earth with a soft thud. Lucas glanced down. It was a glove, but not the familiar gardening glove Ranger would often bring him. This was a tattered, rotting leather work glove scavenged from a ditch or a long-abandoned campsite miles deep in the woods. It was stiff with time and carried the scent of mildew. It was worthless trash. But to Echo, it was payment, he had remembered. He remembered seeing Ranger on this very porch months ago. He remembered the unwritten rule of this house: you don't just take, you give back. You earn your place. Echo gently nudged the glove toward Lucas's knee. His eyes darted back to the trembling female, then fixed on Lucas again. The message was as clear as spoken words. I am home, and I've brought someone who needs sanctuary. Here is our keep. Lucas stared at the pitiful offering, then at the two dogs. A sound ruptured from his chest, a wet, broken thing that was half sob and half pure joy. You damn fool! Lucas choked out tears, carving paths down his face. You beautiful, stubborn fool. Your tab's always been open here? Always. He reached forward, wrapping his arms around Echo's powerful neck, and buried his face in the wild, matted fur. It smelled of rain, of pine, of the raw will to survive. Echo leaned his entire weight into the embrace, exhaling a long, shuddering sigh, finally surrendering the heavy burden of command he'd carried alone. Ranger pressed in, joining the reunion, resting his heavy head on Lucas's shoulder, his tail a steady drumbeat against the earth. The female watched from a safe distance, her body quaking. Lucas made no move toward her. He didn't even meet her gaze. He simply extended a hand palm open and facing the sky, resting it on the grass. It's all right, he murmured to no one in particular. Welcome to the unit. Echo gave her a soft whine of encouragement. Slowly, so bravely, she crept forward and tentatively sniffed Lucas's hand, wincing at the strange scents of coffee and soap. Then she took another step and pressed herself against Echo's side for safety. She was home. Lucas tilted his head back, the sun a blinding white in the sky. The mountains stood as silent, stoic witnesses, the great, indifferent witnesses to this small, profound miracle. They returned to the cabin as one. A slow procession with Lucas at its center, Ranger holding his left flank, Echo limping faithfully on his right, and the new recruit trailing just behind them. The moment they crossed the threshold, the silence of the house shattered. Ranger darted to the toy box, retrieving a worn tennis ball, and dropped it at Echo's paws. But Echo ignored the offering, heading straight for the water bowl, and drinking for a full minute as the others waited. The new female stood frozen by the doorway, her wary eyes fixed on the cold fireplace. Lucas moved to the kitchen and opened the refrigerator. He ignored the bag of kibble. Instead, he pulled out the sharp cheddar, the good deli ham, the remains of a steak. He prepared 3 bowls. "Chow's on," he announced. As the 3 of them ate, the veteran, the survivor, and the refugee, Lucas sank into his armchair. He saw the muddy tracks now scarring his clean floor. He saw the beautiful, welcome chaos. It hit him then that for years he'd seen this cabin as his bunker, a hole to hide from a world that had broken him. He had been so wrong. It was never a bunker. It was a command post, a forward operating base for the lost and the broken, a haven where what was lost could finally be found, where thieves took nothing but loneliness, and the price of entry was just a battered old glove and a heart brave enough to try again. Lucas Harrison, a former gunnery sergeant, gazed at his squad. He lifted the frayed leather glove from the table where it rested like a sacred artifact. "Mission complete," he breathed into the stillness. "We're all home now." This journey reminds us that the walls we build to shield us from pain often become a prison, locking out our greatest joys. Lucas believed his watch had ended, that his heart was too weary to love again. But life in its profound wisdom sent a little thief to breach his defenses and prove him wrong. So often we wait for the perfect moment or the perfect person to finally let our lives begin. But real family isn't defined by blood. It is forged by those who are willing to stand with you in the fiercest of storms. It's about the ones who come back when they could have fled, who offer their tattered, humble gifts as a way of saying, "I choose you." Whether you're a soldier bearing the scars of combat, or simply someone marked by life's battles, hold on to this truth. You are never too fractured to be made whole again, and it is never too late to find your new squad. The only toll for a life filled with love is the courage to unlock the door. If the story of Ranger and Echo captured your heart, please honor them with a like and share it with a friend who understands the power of second chances. And be sure to subscribe to our channel for more tales celebrating the unbreakable bond between humans and animals. Heavenly Father, we lift up our hearts and ask that you bless every person hearing this story today. We pray for those who are lonely, that you might send them a loyal companion to bring warmth to their days. We pray for the brokenhearted that you may heal their spirits, just as you mended Lucas's. Please watch over all our families, both human and animal, and shield them from the tempests of this life. May our homes echo with the sounds of joy, not the deafening silence of solitude. If you receive this prayer and believe in love's restorative power, please affirm it by writing Amen in the comments below. May God bless each and every one of you.